On the morning of September 17th, 1979, Dale Whitmore drove his brand new John Deere 4440 to the fence line between his property and the Carver farm, cut the engine, and climbed down from the cab. He was 44 years old. He farmed 800 acres of prime Nebraska ground in Custer County, owned the biggest operation in the area, wore pressed jeans and boots that had never seen a full day's mud. He bought a new truck every 2 years, and he carried a loan balance that would have kept most men awake at night. But Dale slept fine. Dale believed debt was just leverage. That was what his banker told him. That was what the John Deere dealer told him. That was what every agricultural economist on the extension circuit was saying in 1979. And up to that point, Dale had believed every word of it. Across the fence, 58-year-old Harlan Carver was already working. He sat on a 1962 Farmall 560 with paint so faded it had gone from red to something closer to rust orange in the sunlight. There was a welded crack on the left fender. Harlan had repaired it himself in the barn in 1975 with a stick welder and a piece of scrap steel. The seat had been recovered with a square of foam wrapped in canvas and tacked down with roofing nails. The tractor had cost Harlan $400 at an estate auction in 1971. He had been running it every day for 8 years. Dale watched him move across the field for a moment. Then he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "Harlan, what did you pay for that thing again?" Harlan did not answer right away. He finished the pass, made his turn at the end row with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had turned a tractor at the end of a field 10,000 times. Then let the 560 idle before he answered, $400. Dale laughed. Not a short laugh, a long, comfortable laugh, the kind that belongs to a man who is used to being the smartest person in any given conversation and knows it. $400? And how many times did you have to fix it this year? Twice, Harlan said. Water pump and a fuel line fitting. $60 total in parts. $60. Dale looked back at his 4,440. The tractor still smelled faintly of the factory. It had 40 hours on the clock. 130 horsepower. 8-speed power shift transmission. Air-conditioned cab with a factory radio and tinted glass. He had paid $46,200 for it 4 months earlier, financing $42,000 of that over 7 years at 10.12%. His monthly payment was $792. Then Dale said, "Harlan, I will make you a bet." In Custer County, when Dale Whitmore said the word bet, people paid attention. Not because Dale was reckless, but because he had a reputation for proposing arrangements where the outcome seemed inevitable, and he was usually right about that. Harlan shut the engine off. The field went quiet. He waited. "You and me," Dale said. "Side-by-side fields. I will take your south quarter. You take your north quarter. Same acreage, 160 each. We are both plowing this week anyway before the ground freezes. Whoever finishes first, the other one pays $10,000. Harlan looked at him for a long, steady moment. $10,000 cash, Dale said. "I put it in your hand before we start. You put yours in mine. Winner takes both stacks." There was a pause. Harlan rubbed his jaw. He was not a fast talker. He thought before he spoke. Always had. And that was one reason he had never borrowed money for a tractor. It was also one reason Dale Whitmore had always underestimated him. Because Harlan knew exactly what the bet looked like on paper. The 4,440 had more than double his horsepower. Dale was pulling a 6-bottom plow, covering 7 feet of ground on every pass. Harlan's 4-bottom covered less than 5. Dale had the speed advantage, the width advantage, the comfort advantage. By any rational calculation, this was not a bet. This was a donation. "All right," Harlan said. Dale blinked. "All right? All right. I will take the bet." Dale smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already done the math and already knew how the money was going to move. But before what happened in those fields can make sense, you have to understand what these two machines actually were. Because really, this story lives inside the machines. The John Deere 4440 was the flagship of the 1979 John Deere lineup. 130 horsepower from a turbocharged diesel. The power shift transmission, 8 forward speeds and 4 reverse, was the most sophisticated gearbox in production agriculture at the time. The Soundguard cab was pressurized against dust, cooled against heat, and quiet enough that you could hold a conversation at full engine speed. The tractor weighed 14,000 pounds and could pull a 6-bottom plow through heavy Nebraska soil at nearly 4 miles per hour. Retail price, $46,200. Monthly payment on Dale's loan, $792 every single month, whether the crop was good or bad, whether it rained or did not, whether corn was $2 a bushel or $1.50. 7 years of that. No break, no mercy. Harlon Carver's 1962 Farmall 560 was a different machine in every sense. International Harvester built the 560 from 1958 to 1963. 60 horsepower, live hydraulics, a reputation for mechanical simplicity that farmers who did their own work had always trusted. By 1979, Harlon had put more than 7,000 hours on it. The paint was gone from every horizontal surface. The exhaust stack had been re-welded after cracking in 1975, but the injectors were clean. The engine ran without smoke. The clutch engaged sharp and true. He had pulled a 4-bottom plow behind it since the day he bought it. The same plow his father-in-law had used. Rebuilt with new shares the previous spring for $212. Total investment in Harlon's plowing rig, $612. Every dollar of it already paid. 2 men, 2 machines, 160 acres each. 2 stacks of $10,000 sealed in envelopes and sitting in Harlon's barn office waiting for morning. September 17th arrived cool and dry. Perfect plowing weather. The soil had dried down after rain 4 days earlier to the condition experienced farmers look for. Moist below 6 inches. Firm enough on top to support equipment without rutting. By 6 o'clock in the morning, both men were at the fence line. Dale had brought his hired hand, Rick Sorensen, to witness. Earl Simmons, who farmed the section north of Harlon and had heard about the bet at the grain elevator, drove his pickup over just to watch, carrying a thermos of coffee and having nowhere better to be. They exchanged envelopes. Harlon tucked his into the chest pocket of his coat without opening it. Earl Simmons looked at his watch. 6:15. Both of you ready? Both men nodded. Then go. Both engines started in the same moment. The 4,440's turbo spooled up with a whistle, that sharp sound of forced induction on cold morning air, compression building before the fuel even lit. The 560 fired with the low, even rumble of a naturally aspirated engine that had been maintained well and knew exactly what kind of work it had been built for. Dale dropped his 6-bottom plow at the east fence line and headed west, 6 furrows wide, nearly 4 miles per hour. Inside the sealed cab, the radio was playing. The outside temperature was 51 degrees, but Dale did not feel it. Harlon dropped his 4-bottom and pulled away slower. The 560 did not whistle. It pulled the way a draft horse pulls, from the ground up. 3 miles per hour, 4 furrows, 20 feet of effective width per minute. By 7:30, Dale had a visible lead. From Earl Simmons's truck, the comparison was obvious. One machine was sleek, fast, powerful, sealed tight against dust and weather. The other was open to the September wind, driven by a man in a coat. At 9:47 in the morning, Dale Whitmore's John Deere 4,440 stopped. Not gradually. Not with a warning light. It stopped the way new machines sometimes stop suddenly, completely, and with no obvious explanation from the outside. Dale cut the engine and climbed down. He walked around the tractor systematically and found it almost immediately. Hydraulic fluid was running down the left side of the rear axle housing, dripping into the fresh furrow, soaking into the dark Nebraska soil, dark red against dark earth. He crouched and found the source. A hairline crack in the hydraulic return line fitting, right at the junction where it connected to the rock shaft housing. Factory casting flaw, or an unevenly torqued fitting. It did not matter which. The rock shaft controlled the 3-point hitch. The plow was down and locked, and without hydraulic pressure, the tractor was going nowhere useful. Dale looked across the fence. Harlon Carver was still moving, same heading, same pace. The 560's exhaust stack, breathing that steady gray rhythm. Not rushing, not looking over, just working. Dale walked back to the cab and called Gary Hendress at the John Deere dealership in Broken Bow. Gary, hydraulic line failure on the 4,000. 440. Cracked fitting on the rock shaft return. I need a serviceman out here. Today is Tuesday, Dale, Gary told him. I already have 2 calls out. Earliest I can get somebody to you is early afternoon. Call at 1 o'clock. Dale looked across the fence again. Harlan was already about a quarter of the way through his 160. He hung up the radio, sat down on the tractor step, and waited. At the edge of the field, Earl Simmons poured himself another cup of coffee and watched the 4,440 sitting dead in the middle of the field, while the 560 kept moving across the fence. He did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. Rick Sorensen walked out from the road, looked at the hydraulic stain on the axle, looked at the plow locked in the ground, then looked at Harlan across the fence. Want me to go get the other tractor? He asked. Dale had a 1972 John Deere 4,230 back at the home place for secondary work. How long to get it here? 40 minutes, maybe, and it will not pull a 6 bottom. 4 bottom at most. It will not make the speed. Dale said nothing. Rick walked back to the road. Across the fence, the 560 kept moving. And that is where the real shape of this story begins to reveal itself. Because this is not truly a story about a cracked hydraulic fitting. It is a story about the kind of man who pays $400 for a 17-year-old tractor, runs it for 8 years without a single loan payment, and sleeps peacefully on nights when his neighbor lies awake, calculating whether crop revenue will cover the first of the month. Harlan had started farming in 1948 at age 27. He had come back from Korea with a Purple Heart, a slight tremor in his left hand that never went away, and $260 in discharge pay. Ruth's family had 160 acres in Custer County that her father was getting too old to work alone. Harlan moved in, learned the ground, and bought them out over 12 years through annual payments, not a bank loan. A family arrangement settled with a handshake and honored to the dollar. By 1964, the land was his, free and clear. He added another 160 acres in 1969 when the adjacent farm went up for sale. He financed 20% of it on a 5-year note from the county bank and paid it off in 3 years. He had never financed a piece of equipment in his life. Not once. Not a tractor. Not a plow. Not a grain wagon. When he needed something and did not have the cash, he did not buy it. When he had the cash, he bought used. When the used thing broke, he fixed it himself. His operation generated roughly $35,000 to $40,000 a year on 320 acres of corn and wheat. Operating costs ran about $18,000. Net income, $17,000 to $22,000 per year. No equipment payments, no land debt, nothing hanging over him. When the co-op crowd asked Harlan why he did not upgrade his machinery, he always gave the same answer. I farm what I can afford to lose. People took that to mean he was pessimistic, but really, that was not it at all. What it meant was that Harlan understood any given year could bring drought, price collapse, mechanical failure, or all 3 at once. And the only way to survive those things was to keep costs so low that even a bad year left you standing. The night before the bet, Ruth had asked him why he agreed to it. Because I think Dale needs to learn something, Harlan said. You think you can beat that tractor? I do not know. I might not. But whether I win or lose, I think something is going to happen in those fields that Dale needs to see. Ruth knew better than to push any further. In 31 years of marriage, she had learned that when Harlan said something was going to happen, it usually did. The John Deere service truck arrived at 1:17 in the afternoon. The mechanic, Tom Briggs, crouched by the axle and confirmed the diagnosis in 90 seconds. Cracked return fitting, he said. Classic casting flaw. We have seen a few on the early production run. How long to fix it? Dale asked. Half an hour to drain it, swap the fitting, refill, bleed the system. Call it 45 minutes. Tom went to work. Across the fence, Harlan had been plowing since 6:15 that morning. He had already turned more than half of his 160. He had stopped once at noon, for 22 minutes, to eat the lunch Ruth packed, and to check the 560's oil and water, the way he did at midday on every long field day without exception. Then he climbed back on and went to work again. Tom Briggs finished the repair at 2 o'clock. The plow came up, the 4,440 moved again. But by then, the shape of the day had already changed. Harlan had been plowing for nearly 8 hours, and the truth was obvious now. Dale was not going to close that lead before dark. At 4:30, the 560 finished. Harlan made his final pass, pulled the forebottom out of the ground at the west fence line, and shut the engine off. Then he climbed down from the open seat and stood there looking back across the field. 320 furrows, every one of them straight. After that, he walked over to Earl Simmons's truck. Earl handed him a cup of coffee from a fresh thermos. Dale's 4,440 still had about 40 acres left. Harlan drank his coffee. He did not look across the fence. That part matters. He did not stand there enjoying another man's trouble. He looked at his own field. Dale finished at 7:20 in the evening. The tractor's headlights cut across the plowed ground in the near dark. He pulled the plow out at the west fence line and drove to the field road. Then he sat there in the cab with the engine running and the radio off. Across the field, he could see the lights of Harlan's farmhouse. The kitchen window was lit. Smoke drifted from the chimney. Harlan had been home almost 3 hours. Dale climbed down. Rick Sorensen was waiting by the truck. Neither man said anything. Then Dale pulled the cash envelope from the glove box, crossed the road to Harlan's porch light, and knocked. Harlan answered the door. "You finished?" Harlan said. Not really a question. "A while ago," Dale answered. Harlan opened the door. "Come in." Ruth had coffee on the stove. Dale sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Harlan had told Ruth he believed Dale needed to learn something. Harlan sat across from him. Ruth poured coffee and left the room without being asked. She understood these conversations. Dale placed the envelope on the table, $10,000 cash. Harlan picked it up and slid it into the drawer beside the refrigerator where he kept farm receipts. Then Dale spoke. "That fitting," he said. "The hydraulic fitting that cracked. I know if it had not cracked, I would have finished 3 hours before you." Harlan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "That is probably right," he said. "So it was luck?" Harlan looked at him. "The fitting cracking was luck," he said. "The fact that I could afford to lose this bet was not luck. The fact that you have got $792 going out every first of the month, whether that tractor runs or not, that is not luck either. That is the bet you made when you bought the machine." Dale went quiet. And really, that was the moment. Not the field, not the breakdown, not the finish line. The moment was right there, at that kitchen table, with coffee between them and the noise drained out of the day. Because what Harlan was saying was simple, but brutal. The machine was only part of the equation. The payment was the real risk. "If you had bought a used tractor," Harlan said, "paid for it outright, and it broke down in the middle of a field this morning, what would you have done?" Dale thought about it. "Fixed it myself, probably. Or left it and come back." "And your payment?" "There would be no payment." "That is right," Harlan said. "There would be no payment." Then he set down his cup. "Dale, I am not trying to embarrass you. You are a good farmer. But you have got 800 acres, and you are one bad year away from a conversation at the bank that goes different from all the ones before. When wheat went to $1.70 and 76, how did that feel?" "Tight," Dale admitted. "With your payment, how tight?" Dale did not answer. He did not have to. The answer was very tight. The kind of tight that makes a man quiet at dinner. The kind of tight that follows him into bed and waits there in the dark. Harlan kept going. "In the drought of 74, I netted maybe $9,000 on the whole farm. You know what I did? I went to a farm sale in October and bought a used disc for $80 because mine was worn out. Paid cash. Went home. That was a hard year, and it is over now, and I still have my farm." Then he looked at Dale and asked the question that cut all the way through the pride, all the way through the machinery, all the way through the image of what success looked like in 1979. "What would you have done with $9,000 and a $700 monthly payment?" Dale was a smart man. He did not need to answer that either. He left at 9 o'clock, drove home in his new truck through the dark, did not turn on the radio. And what happened between 1979 and 1987 in Custer County happened in county after county across the Corn Belt, in Iowa, in Kansas, in South Dakota, in Minnesota, in Ohio, anywhere farmers had borrowed heavily during the boom years, trusting that grain prices would stay high, interest rates would stay manageable, and land values would keep rising. But none of those things held. In 1980, The Carter administration placed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union after the invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets had been the primary driver of American grain exports for much of the decade. The embargo hit demand hard and fast. Corn that had been $2.30 a bushel in the fall of 1979 fell to $1.60 by the end of 1980. At the same time, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker was squeezing inflation out of the economy by driving interest rates to levels not seen since the Civil War. The prime rate hit 21.5% in June of 1981. That number destroyed people. Farm loans made at 9 and 10% came up for renewal at 16 and 17. Land values that had been climbing 15 to 20% a year stopped rising, then began to fall. Farmers who had borrowed against collateral that seemed solid suddenly discovered that collateral was evaporating beneath them. Between 1981 and 1987, more than 230,000 American farms went out of business. Not just bad years, not just thin margins, full foreclosures, bank sales, equipment auctions, farms that had been in the same family for 3 and 4 generations, gone in a single season. That was the world rushing toward Dale Whitmore. Gary Hendress, the John Deere dealer in Broken Bow, the same man Dale had called on the morning the 4,440 failed, closed his doors in November of 1985. He had built his business on equipment financing. In the late 1970s, that made him look smart. But when farmers could no longer service their debt and came in to negotiate, Gary had no room to give them. He liquidated everything, moved to Omaha, sold insurance for the rest of his working life, and never came back to Broken Bow except for his mother's funeral. Dale held on longer than most, and that matters too, because he was not a fool. He was genuinely skilled. He had enough land equity to keep the bank from calling his loans in 1981 and 1982, but skill alone could not fix the arithmetic once the margins collapsed. By 1983, with corn at $1.80 and his payment schedule unchanged, the farm was bleeding. Then, in the spring of 1985, the bank called the note on his equipment. The 4,440, the tractor that had sat dead in Harlan's South Quarter for 4 hours on that September morning 6 years earlier, went to auction in June of 1985. It sold for $22,000. Dale still owed $31,000 on it. The difference came out of his hide. He barely kept the home place, and only by releasing 2 rented quarters he had held on option. He went into 1986 farming 400 acres with a used 1972 John Deere 4,320 that he bought at a farm sale for $6,000 cash. No payment, no service contract, no air-conditioned cab. A humbler machine, yes, but paid for. And that is the part that hits hardest, because really, by then Dale had been forced into the same lesson Harlan tried to hand him across that kitchen table years earlier. The new machine had not just cost more, it had narrowed his choices. It had removed his room to breathe. When the bad years came, and they did come, there was nowhere for that pressure to go except straight through him. Meanwhile, Harlan Carver farmed through the 1980s the same way he had always farmed. A lean year in corn might net him $11,000. $11,000 was not comfortable, but $11,000 with no equipment payment was survivable. Ruth kept the household on a budget that left no room for anything unnecessary. They did not miss a property tax payment. They did not skip maintenance on the 560. They did not sit across from any banker for conversations that turned sharp or desperate. Their banking relationship stayed polite and routine because there was no leverage hanging over the table. Then, in the spring of 1986, the adjacent farm north of Harlan's Quarter went to foreclosure auction. He went. He had $48,000 in a savings account, built from the difference between what he made and what he spent every year since 1964, when his land had been paid off. Emergency money. That was what it was for. But for 22 years, there had not been an emergency big enough to need it. That farm, 160 acres, had sold for $2,000 an acre in 1981. At auction, it opened at $75,000. The bank wanted it gone. The farm crisis had scared most buyers to the sidelines. Harlan bid $85,000 and got it. Cash. No mortgage. No loan. He was 65 years old, farming more land than he had ever farmed before, at prices that would have been catastrophic for anybody carrying debt. But he was not carrying debt. That is the whole point. That had always been the point. In 1988, a young journalist from the Broken Bow newspaper was assigned to write about the farmers who had survived the decade. Her editors sent her to Harlan Carver because Gary Hendris, before leaving for Omaha, had told her there was a farmer north of town who had done something right, while almost everyone else had done something wrong. She sat at the same kitchen table where Dale Whitmore had sat 8 years earlier and asked Harlan how he had made it through. Harlan thought for a while. He was 67 years old then. His left hand still carried the tremor from Korea. He folded it into his right hand and held it still. Then he answered in the same plain way he always did. "I farm what I can afford to lose." The reporter asked what that meant, and Harlan explained it the way only a man who had lived it could explain it. "Any year can go wrong," he said. "Weather goes wrong, prices go wrong, equipment breaks down, and when those things happen, some farmers survive and some do not. The difference is almost never skill, almost never hard work, almost always. It is what they owe." That was the line. Not what they owned, what they owed. The ones with payments stacked on top of payments, land, equipment, operating loans, all of it piled together. Those were the men who ran out of room when the bad year came. The ones who owned what they farmed with, who kept their costs low enough that a bad year was painful but not fatal. Those were the ones who stayed standing. Then she asked about the $10,000 bet. Word had made its way around the county eventually, the way things always do. But even then, Harlan would not turn it into a story at another man's expense. "I want you to leave the other man's name out of it," he said. "He is a good man. He learned something hard, and he came out the other side, and he is still farming. That is worth more than any story about a bet." So she left the name out. The article ran under the headline, "North of Broken Bow, One Farm's Quiet Secret." There was one paragraph about the wager, no names, and what it said was simple. Carver recalled a wager with a neighbor in 1979. New machine against old, same ground, same day. The newer tractor had twice the horsepower. It also had a payment. The payment, Carver said, was the part that mattered. Not in that field that day. In every field after it. That line stayed behind because it was true. The 1962 Farmall 560 never became a symbol because it was glamorous. It became a symbol because it kept proving the same point over and over again. The machine was not fast, it was not impressive, it was not modern, but it was paid for. And when a machine is paid for, it stops being just equipment. It becomes breathing room. It becomes time. It becomes options. The 560 stayed on the property. Harlan retired in 1995. His son-in-law, Glenn Marsh, took over the operation and kept using the 560 for secondary work, light dissing, moving grain wagons, fence projects. In 2001, it crossed 10,000 hours. Glenn held a small celebration in the machine shed. Just family. Folding chairs. Pie that Carol had made. A thermos of coffee. Harlan started the 560 and let it idle. He was 80 years old. His hand still tremored. He rested it on the 560's hood and pressed down to steady it. Then he said 4 words. $400. He was not really speaking to anyone in particular. He was just stating a fact. But really, it was more than a fact by then. It was something closer to companionship, something that had stayed with him through drought, low prices, old age, and a decade that had broken men with newer and better-looking machines. Ruth died in 2003. Harlan died in 2007 at 86, still living on the farm in the same house where he had sat across from Dale Whitmore on that September night in 1979. His funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Broken Bow. Dale Whitmore sat in the 4th pew. He had driven 2 hours to be there. The two men had kept a quiet, respectful friendship since the night of the bet. Not the kind that draws attention to itself. Just a wave across the fence. The occasional cup of coffee. The shared understanding of two men who had both seen the 1980s clearly and come out the other side still farming. At the service, Glenn Marsh stood to speak. "My father-in-law bought that tractor for $400 in 1971, he said. He ran it for more than 30 years. It cost him $60 in parts the year of the bet, which I have come to think of as the most important $60 ever spent in Custer County." That line landed because everyone there understood what he meant. It had outlasted every piece of new equipment bought by every neighbor who laughed at it. It had outlasted the dealership that called it obsolete. It had outlasted every argument for why a farmer needed to finance something bigger, newer, and more impressive. Harlan used to say he farmed what he could afford to lose, Glenn said. That tractor was the physical expression of that philosophy. And then he drove the point all the way home. If it had broken down that September morning, instead of the machine across the fence, if the roles had been reversed, Harlan would have lost the bet, and it would not have mattered. He would have fixed the 560 himself in that shed for whatever it cost in parts, and gone back to work the next morning. There was no payment to fall behind on. There was no bank to call a note. There was just a tractor, and a man, and the ground between them. That, Glenn said, was what Harlan wanted people to understand. Not that old is always better than new. Not that debt is always wrong, but that what you own, you control. And what controls you will eventually remind you of that fact at the worst possible moment. The tractor is still in the shed. It still runs. And in a way, that is why this story refuses to disappear. Because really, this was never just about $10,000. It was never just about a hydraulic fitting. It was never just about one September day. It was about the difference between what you own and what owns you. Dale Whitmore was, by many measures, the better farmer. He covered more ground. He generated higher gross revenue. He was organized, capable, not afraid of hard work. In a stable environment, his approach probably would have looked like the winning one. But agriculture is not a stable environment. It never has been. The price of corn in 1979 was not the price of corn in 1982. The interest rate in 1978 was not the interest rate in 1981. Every input and output in Dale's business plan changed, some of them catastrophically, within just a few years of committing himself to a 7-year payment schedule. Harlan's business plan had one variable that did not change. He owed nothing. And when everything else changed, that one thing did not. That gave him the one thing the farm crisis took away from thousands of better-equipped, higher-grossing operations: options. When the floor dropped out, Harlan had options. He could spend less, produce less, wait it out. He could buy land at the bottom of a crash because he had spent 20 years saving instead of servicing debt. He could survive a bad year without a banker stepping into the middle of his life. Dale had fewer choices. He had to keep the 4,440 running. Keep the crop coming in, keep the payment going out, and hope the floor held long enough. But the floor did not hold, and that cracked hydraulic fitting on September 17, 1979, did not teach Dale anything by itself. What taught him was the quiet conversation at the kitchen table that night. The 8 years that followed, the auction in June of 1985 where a machine he had paid $46,200 for, sold for $22,000. The arithmetic of a decade he had not planned for and could no longer undo. What he learned was what Harlan had known from the beginning. Debt removes your options. And in farming, options are everything. They are the difference between a hard year and a lost farm. On the side of the 560's engine block, written later in careful block letters with a paint pen by Glenn Marsh after Harlan's funeral, are 4 words. $400, 1971. Paid for. That is the whole story. Everything else, the bet, the fitting, the crisis, the auction, the years that tested every farm in the county, all of that is just context around the central truth. The machine was paid for. That was the point. That was always the point. And maybe that is why this story still hits as hard now as it did then. Because it is not only about farming, it is about pressure, it is about risk. It is about how quickly pride can become exposure, and how quietly discipline can become survival. One man bought horsepower, the other man bought time. When the storm came, only one of those purchases kept giving him choices. If this story means something to you, if you grew up around old machines that outlasted the payment books on the new ones, or if someone in your family made the kind of decision Harlan made, and only now you fully understand why, leave a comment and share that memory. And if you want more stories like this, told straight and told with the weight they deserve, stay with us.